This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Romulo Lollato, K-State Wheat Production Specialist, leads today's show with details on wheat's first hollow stem. He says what stage the crop is measuring at in Kansas. K-State canola breeder Mike Stamm keeps the show rolling as he explains how the canola crop has been progressing. Mike also shares what insects and diseases canola growers should be scouting for. Ending the show is K-State Horticulture Extension Specialist Cynthia Domenghini as she discusses a variety of actions that can be taken to prepare for the garden season. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show discussing first hollow stem with K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato. Romulo, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Shelby. It's great to be here.
Romulo, what is first hollow stem?
So, Shelby, first hollow stem is something that we call for pretty much a tool that we have, right, to measure when to remove cattle from wheat that is being grazed, but that we intend to harvest for grain. And for us to understand a little bit more in terms of what that actually is, we need to think about the wheat crop development and how it moves along in the year, right? We plant this wheat crop back in the fall. It comes up and it emerges and it tillers out, and then it goes through a dormancy, right? So essentially, it goes through a period that we call vernalization, and that's something that the winter wheat crop needs to actually turn reproductive. So up to that point in time, it's only leaves and, it's vegetative, right? So there's really no reproductive structure there yet. Now, once the crop goes through, 6 to 8 weeks of soil temperatures below about 49 degrees, then it triggers the initiation of the reproductive development of the plant. Essentially, what happens is, at that crown level, which is below ground, it starts to form a tiny little head that will then be pushed up in the stem of the plant as that plant elongates the stem, right? Until later in the spring, it comes out as a head, is being pushed through that stem, and it comes out from the boot as a head later on, right? So, in that process, as that developing head is being pushed through the stem, right underneath it, it forms a hollow stem, right? So essentially, the majority of our wheat varieties, they are what we call hollow stem variety, meaning that essentially if you split that open, it's hollow right underneath that developing head. Beyond the topic for today, but there are solid stem varieties, right, that are being developed, but that's really beyond the topic that we're talking about today. They're very specifically for controlling pests, and so really they're kind of beyond our focus here today. So that's the development of the hollow stem, right, as that head is being pushed up the stem. But what we call the first hollow stem is when we have more or less kind of half an inch of hollow stem in between the developing head and the crown. Right, so to be more specific, it's about 1.5 centimeters, or roughly half an inch, or the diameter of a dime. Right, if you have a dime in your pocket, it's a very easy way to just know if the crop is at that stage or not. So essentially, if there is about half an inch of hollow stem in between that developing head that is being pushed up the stem and the crown of the crop, that's the stage that we call first hollow stem.
Why do we care about first hollow stem?
So as I mentioned early on, right, it is a tool that we have to know when to remove cattle from wheat pastures. And why do we care? Why is it important? Well, again, thinking about the plant, right, up to that point in time, if you have less than about half an inch or so of stem being developed underneath that head, chances are that the head is still under the soil, right, still under the soil surface. And the cattle is grazing that wheat pasture. And as long as the head is underneath the soil surface, well, our yield is relatively protected, right? Because the cattle is just eating leaves. Again, at that point in time, the crop has a very good capacity of recovering those lost leaves at this point in time. There is a little bit of a penalty, yes, from these dual purpose systems, perhaps 10%, 15% or so, depending how we manage that grazing. We can expect lower yields if we're grazing it properly. But if we're not grazing it properly and we're grazing it pretty late, now those yield penalties become very steep, right? So if we're talking about, on average 10, 15% yield loss on a crop that was grazed properly. Now, if we're grazing it past first hollow stem, now that yield loss is going to increase anywhere from 1 to 5% per day that we're grazing. So it's really, really steep yield loss if we're grazing it past first hollow stem. Again, the reason is simple, is because the cattle is now removing those heads, those developing heads, instead of only removing leaves. Why is there such a large yield drag range, 1 to 5% per day? Really goes back to recovery conditions after grazing is terminated, after grazing stopped. So let's say that, you stop grazing and right away you have some nice moisture and you can put your fertilizer out and there's good, cool temperatures for the crop to really recover that leaf area. Maybe you're only going to have about 1% per day of yield loss for those days that you graze past first hollow stem. Now, let's say that you grazed pretty hard past first hollow stem and conditions are harsh as well, dry, hot conditions, right? That the crop really needs to speed up development without being able to catch up on leaf growth. That's when you have a lot steeper yield losses of up to 5% per day. So let's give a clear example, right? Let's say that today we are at first hollow stem, for example, and we graze 10 days past today. So graze until April 12 or April 13th, right? Well, these 10 days, if the recovery is good for the crop, cool and moist and so on, well, perhaps you're only losing about 10% yield on top of those 10-15% that we talked initially. But if it's hot and dry, well, maybe you're losing up to 50% of your yield potential, right, for grazing these extra 10 days. So it can be very steep, again, up to 5% per day, but it really depends on weather conditions. The main message here is that we care about first hollow stem, because if we remove cattle at that point in time, then we're minimizing the chances of these very steep yield losses. And as we're talking about these, it's important also to highlight when and how to measure these. And especially, if you're grazing a wheat field, you don't really want to sample inside the fence of that field because the development there is going to be delayed a little bit from removing all of those leaves by the cattle. So just going right outside the fence for that same field and getting those plants that were not grazed by the cattle and pulling them up from the bottom, right? You need to see some roots and the crown there. And then splitting those stems, the main stems, they're going to be further along, splitting them up lengthwise and really checking for that development of that first hollow stem in a crop that was not grazed, but from the same field, because varieties matter, planting dates matter, and management matter, right? And so again, from the very same field, go just outside the fence, pull some plants from the roots up, and split them lengthwise and see how much development of the hollow stem we have for those primary heads.
For most of your wheat varieties, are they at first hollow stem?
Well, yes, Shelby. So for context here, right, we do have a trial that goes out in Hutchinson every year. And we use Hutchinson because it's kind of the northern end of where we expect growers to graze, right? And we're checking for first hollow stem at that location of anywhere from 15, 20 varieties, depending on the year, right? And in our measurements, as of about a week ago, we had 3 or 4 varieties that were already past first hollow stem, meaning that if you were grazing those varieties in the region, it was about time a week ago, right, to remove cattle from those pastures. This week, though, all varieties have already passed. So with the conditions that we have had, a little bit warmer conditions, just warm enough for the crop to get growing, we are already measuring pretty long hollow stems, really 2 or 3 inches of hollow stem underneath those developing heads. So, yes, this week, absolutely, we need to be on the lookout for that. Again, the right date would have been a week ago here for us to be very carefully looking at that. But, for some parts of the state, North Central, Northwest Kansas, we're probably not there yet, but we're getting there, right? So, yes, if you're South Central through Southwest Kansas, absolutely, it's probably already time that we need to have removed those cattle out of the wheat pasture in the last few days. If you haven't done so yet, there's still time, right? But for North Central, Northwest Kansas, if you're grazing wheat pastures and you're wanting to harvest for yield, absolutely keep an eye on, because we are in a very critical point in time right now where that cattle removal needs to be done. And there's also a tool, a Mesonet tool that we put out, and that tool is like a crop modeling tool based on growing conditions, growing degrees in the soil, right? That's really what drives first hollow stem. And so growers can go to the Kansas Mesonet website and check what's the chances of variety having reached first hollow stem based on their location in the state. So that tool, we keep it updated. It's been developed a few years back, but still reflective of our conditions. So definitely we suggest growers go and check it out. And that can guide whether it is time for them to go out and check their own fields or not, right? I wouldn't make my decision 100% based on that tool alone, because that, as I mentioned, first hollow stem will be field specific, but it's a good tool to give us an indication whether we should already start to be concerned of that or not in our own operations.
Romulo, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby. It was great to be here with you today.
That was K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato. You can find the Mesonet website at mesonet.ksu.edu. I will link it in today's show notes on actday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about canola in Kansas with K-State canola breeder Mike Stamm. Mike, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
Mike, how is canola looking in Kansas?
It looks really good so far. We've made it through the winter months, which is always important for the crop. From what I've seen of the crop so far, very little winter kill. Even some of the smaller canola that came up a little bit on the late side because of some delays with planting and soil moisture conditions last fall, even that small canola has survived. We were fortunate to have some snow cover this year when temperatures were bitterly cold, and that certainly helps. So that was good to see as the field started to green back up this spring.
When you are across Kansas looking at canola, how is it looking right now?
Right now, I'd say the biggest issue is moisture. You know, we're already starting to see a little bit of moisture stress as the crop greens up and is entering the bolting and now flowering stages. So we're hoping that these rain chances that we see here in the near-term forecast come to fruition, because the crop in some places could certainly use that moisture as we go into the reproductive stages, which is the peak for water demand of the crop.
And we're on the tail end time frame of maybe people doing some top dressing fertilizer, but if they haven't done it yet, what do you recommend they do?
Well, there certainly is still time to apply a top dress to canola. We've seen in research done in other canola growing regions that you can apply a top dress fertilizer into that early flowering stage and still see some benefit. So if a grower was late applying a top dress, we've had a lot of wind here lately, so not a lot of good days to be spraying out there, they could still go ahead and apply that top dress now and see some benefit.
What are some key nutrients for them to consider?
Certainly nitrogen at this time of year is probably the most important, but also sulfur. You know, we always talk about canola being a crop that replies to sulfur fertility. And so if sulfur wasn't applied at any other period of the growing season, now would be a good time to include that as well.
What are some things you're keeping an eye on as we look forward?
Right now, the biggest concern with management practices with the crop as we get into flowering is probably insect pressure. You know, there are a few insects that we certainly want to be aware of because they can affect the flowering of the crop, primarily just feeding on open flowers. That would be the diamondback moth larva, the lygus bug, and cabbage aphids. So we encourage producers this time of year, as we start to enter the flowering period, to certainly scout their fields and look for those pressures, because they can be detrimental if they're not caught on time.
Are some of these insects coming in right now or in a month or two?
I would say about any time now, as we move to the tail end of the growing season, it's a good time to be out scouting. We've had enough warm weather to really drive those insect pressures, and so I think it's certainly time to be keeping an eye on things.
What does the diamondback moth look like?
The diamondback moth larva is what we really want to keep our eye on, and it's just a very small green worm, less than an inch in length. And so a good thing to do when you walk out into a flowering canola field is just to shake the raceme into your hand. And if you see any worms fall out into your hand, that's a good way to identify it, because that's typically what we see is the diamondback moth larva. Or you could take a sweep net into a flowering field and find them as well.
What does the cabbage aphid look like?
Well, the cabbage aphid would be found, again, in the flowering raceme of the crop. And a lot of times they'll colonize it, so you'll see these bunches of aphids on the flowering, the flower structure of the plant, and they're actually fairly easy to spot, and they're really the most common aphid at the reproductive stage of the plant. So, again, look for those hot spots where you see some discoloration in the field, especially when it's at full flower, and you'd be able to spot those pretty well.
Is this needing to walk and scout through the full field or really just around the edges?
It's good to start around the edges, but if you start to see some hot spots, you're probably better off walking out further into the field and taking a look at things.
What are some diseases maybe to keep an eye on for canola?
Probably the most important disease at the flowering stage is sclerotinia, or white mold. So sclerotinia comes in when we have very wet conditions during flowering, and typically the time to spray a fungicide to help control that is at what we call flower drop. So as the flowers drop off the raceme onto the leaves, the disease uses those petals as a food source to penetrate into the leaves of the plant. And so that's the most critical time for control of sclerotinia. And again, it's really a disease that we see when we have very wet conditions at flowering. And if that field has had a history of canola, you'd be more likely to find that disease if it would happen to be there. Does
white mold just look like white mold?
It does have a white mold, obviously, look to it. But you will see it later in the season as it forms on the stem of the plant, and that it weakens the stem, and then it will cause severe lodging. So it's important to catch it early. And again, when we have wet conditions and we have a history of canola in the field, that would be when you would most likely want to scout for that disease.
So, Mike, as we think about the canola crop overall, what are really some best-case scenarios as we look forward into canola being the best it can be?
Well, again, moisture is most critical this time of year because we are entering peak water demand for the crop. And then we don't want to go straight from spring to summer. We want a nice gradual increase in our temperatures because canola is a cool season crop and it likes those cooler temperatures as it's flowering. And so we don't need any major heat waves over the next couple of months. We want it to stay kind of nice and cool and gradual with some intermittent rain to help the crop along.
And are there some meetings potentially coming up or some canola field days coming up that listeners might want to keep an eye out for?
There certainly will be canola meetings in May, likely centered around what we are doing with our research trials in the state, particularly variety development. But those will typically be towards the middle of May, and I just encourage listeners to keep an eye out for more information. We don't have anything specifically on the calendar just yet, although I will say we are on schedule to have a canola stop at the May 19th spring field day at Garden City, but there will be other canola meetings as well.
Mike, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me.
That was K-State canola breeder Mike Stamm. A great way to know when those canola field days will be happening in May is to subscribe to the K-State's Agronomy eUpdate newsletters. You can do that by going to eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and Troy Joshua of the National Agricultural Statistics Survey as they talk about how some USDA reports were discontinued in 2024 but are now being reinstated for 2025, which most are starting this May.
A reinstatement of USDA reports discontinued last year.
We heard from many individuals, organizations, farmers, as well as congressionals that they wanted us to reinstate those programs.
Troy Joshua of the National Agricultural Statistics Service explains why the July cattle report and various county estimate reports for crops and livestock were ended in 2024.
That was as a result of the budget level that we received in March. Those decisions was not made lightly at all because we realized that many individuals utilized the data, as well as we heard that from our partners out there in the agricultural communities that making these decisions had directly impacted them and their processes.
And how they were reinstated for 2025.
We looked at the budget. We made some decisions as a part of our processes to try to manage this ahead of time. We were able to reinstate those programs.
The July cattle report is scheduled for release July 25th. Joshua explains the importance of this report to end users.
The individuals that use that data are livestock producers and meat industries, helping the ranchers, feedlot operators, and processors plan for their herd management, procurement, and prices based on cattle and supply trends. Market analysts and traders, they review and they look at that information, forecasting beef prices, supply trends as well. Policymakers and agribusinesses also utilize that data as well.
County estimates for crops and livestock, however, begins in May 6th, specifically for
corn, sorghum, and soybeans, county estimates. And that data is a reflection of where the crops is actually located in respect to not just corn, sorghum, and soybeans on May 6th. Cotton will be published on May 12th. Cattle will be published on May 13th. And finally, rice and peanuts will be published on May 23rd.
The reinstated reports and any of the many NASS reports and data sets can be found online at www.nass.usda.gov. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because when we come back, we'll have this week's horticultural segment.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist Cynthia Domenghini says that conducting a soil test, controlling broadleaf weeds in lawns, and mulching landscape beds are just a few of the things we can do to prepare for the garden season. Cynthia, we're still really getting ready for the heart of the garden season. Some cool crops have been planted, but for the most part, really just getting the garden going, we want to start with that soil test.
Exactly. If you haven't done a soil test in probably the last 2 years or so, it would be a good idea to start out with that. That's going to give you information you need to know about the fertility of your soil so that you can add supplemental fertilizer as needed, or maybe you don't need to add anything and you can just add in organic matter to improve the soil texture. So that soil test is really your starting point for the garden season. All of the information you need for doing a soil test is on the website, and that's going to give you the best information for how to collect the sample, because it's more than just digging up some dirt from the garden. There are some more specific requirements. So if you are not sure where to look, start with your local extension office and they'll be able to direct you. They'll also be able to tell you if you need to mail it in or if you can drop it off at the extension office. They're the best source for information on how to get that test submitted.
We also want to be thinking about broadleaf weeds right now in the lawn.
Right. And I offer this garden prep information, kind of maybe not. Some people don't mind having a few weeds in their lawn. And for those people, you can ignore them. Some of these broadleaf weeds are an early food source for our bees and other pollinators, so I hesitate to do anything about those. But for those of you who are looking for a uniform lawn, now is the time to treat for broadleaf weeds. So again, you can look at your local extension agency for recommendations for identifying what those broadleaf weeds are first, and then recommendations on how to treat for them, if that's the route you choose.
Aeration is another thing that takes place in the lawn, typically in April?
Exactly, yeah. The aeration can start in March, but go through April, and that's specifically for cool season grasses. With aerating the lawn, that's something that you may want to contact a local maintenance company to assist you with. Those machines that they use can be a bit hefty. And so if you don't have experience with that, or perhaps you just don't want to do it, you can find a professional to take care of that for you. And aeration is a great practice for improving the oxygen flow to the roots of your turf grass. It also helps the water soak in better, which means the nutrients, when you do fertilize your lawn, the nutrients are going to get to that root zone easier. So aerating is a practice that is recommended this time of year.
Another thing they can think about is maybe removing some of the flower stalks as well.
As your spring flowering blooms, your tulips and daffodils, as those flowers die back, you can cut the flower stalks off. Leave those leaves intact because they will continue to generate energy stored in the roots to support next year's bloom. But the flower stalks can be cut off. You don't have to remove daffodil stalks if you don't want to, if they're not bothering you. But the tulip stalks can be a bit unsightly, so you may want to cut those back. But yes, the leaves should stay intact until they die back naturally.
Maybe one other thing we can cover this week would be mulching landscape beds?
Yes, we highly recommend mulching the landscapes. Mulch helps with moderating the soil temperature, which is nice in the winter, but also in the summer when things heat up. The mulch also helps prevent weeds from germinating, and it helps retain moisture in the soil. So all three of those things are going to benefit your plants. But it's also going to save you time in the garden with maintenance and also money because you're not going to have to be applying as much water to the landscape beds.
That's Cynthia Domenghini, a K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist on preparing for the garden season. More information is available at local extension offices and in the Kansas Garden Guide. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.